Last year, when my wife and I were expecting our daughter, we picked a beautiful name, Lila. It was a name that flowed like a gentle breeze, filled with warmth and kindness. Yet, shortly after her birth, something terrifying happened that turned our lives inside out and left me questioning my own sanity. It was a typical night. Lila had just been put down, and the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps around you and feels almost sacred. That's when I heard it, a soft whispering coming from the nursery. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps the creaks of an old house settling into the chilling night. But as I listened more closely, I distinctly heard someone call her name, Lila. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I quietly crept to the door and peered through the small crack. There was no one in there, just the crib, the soft mobile spinning lazily above, and Lila, sleeping soundly, blissfully unaware of the sinister shadow that had seeped into our home. Thankfully, she was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, like we'd crossed into a realm we weren't supposed to. Over the next few weeks, the haunting whispers continued, and weird things began happening. Once, I swear I saw the outline of a child's handprint on the nursery window, even though I hadn't let anyone near the house. Every time I brought it up to my wife, she shrugged it off as postpartum nerves, urging me to seek help. But it wasn't my sanity that I questioned, these were real manifestations, something darker than our mundane life. It got even stranger when one night, I awoke to Lila's cries echoing through the house. Rushing into the room, I found her wide-eyed, fixated on the corner of the room, her tiny finger pointed at something invisible. I panicked and scooped her up, trembling as I felt the weight of whatever unseen presence loomed near us. I knew I had to do something. I became obsessed, scouring the internet for anything that could explain this phenomenon. That's when I stumbled upon countless forums, each filled with heart-wrenching stories of children who seemed to have a connection to the ethereal realm, many accompanied by bizarre, folklore-inspired names. Suddenly, it all clicked. The name Lila derived from ancient roots and was tied to an old lore I could scarcely comprehend, a name said to call forth spirits from beyond, suggesting that perhaps my daughter was more than just my little girl, she could be a vessel for something unfathomable. With each ghostly whisper that echoed through the walls, the urgency of change became palpable. I approached my wife with what I'd learned, fearful and desperate. I suggested we consider changing Lila's name, perhaps to something less steeped in mystery and darkness, something that could sever any ties to the unsettling occurrences that now surrounded her. But she was vehemently opposed, her heart set on the name that laced our daughter's identity with beauty. "You can't just change it because you're scared of shadows," she yelled, her voice laced with anger and disbelief. "What kind of parent would do that? You're being irrational." In that moment, a chasm formed between us, split by fear and misunderstanding. Our relationship began to unravel, arguing over what felt like life or death to me became the new normal, my wife seeing me not as a caring father but as a paranoid lunatic. And then the horrors escalated. One evening, as I sat watching a movie with the sound turned low, I became acutely aware of Lila's cries rising like a siren in the night. I moved instinctively, racing to her room and coming to an abrupt stop at the threshold. The room was cast in shadows, but I swear I saw a figure hovering at Lila's crib, its dark form shrouded in an unsettling aura. I bolted forward, the adrenaline sending my heart into a frenzy, but as I grasped Lila in my arms, the figure dissipated, leaving nothing but the haunting feeling of being watched, as if time slowed and reality warped around me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I was convinced that Lila was in danger, and if I didn't act soon, something irreparable would happen. Frustrated and alone, I began calling her by different names in the hopes of masking the darkness lurking just beyond our world: Rose, Lily, even Daisy. My daughter, thank God, seemed content, cooing and gurgling in response, but my wife grew furious, hurling insults when I refused to use her chosen name. "You're making a mockery of our daughter," she screamed at me, tears spilling down her cheeks. "She deserves better than a father who's too scared to face his own demons." Each confrontation felt like nails on a chalkboard, deepening the rift, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trying to keep Lila safe. But then it happened. One night, as I lay beside her on the bed, I awoke suddenly, drenched in sweat, a weight bearing down on my chest. I turned to check on her. Lila was gone. The nursery door stood ajar, and dread consumed me. I quickly bolted upright, racing through the dark corridors until I found her. She wasn't in her room. I searched the house, a panic setting in, with every shadow feeling alive. Just as I was about to scream her name, I heard a giggle from behind the living room curtain. I yanked it aside, and there she was, standing and staring at what seemed to be a swirling mass of darkness in the corner of the room. "Lila," I croaked, but she didn't respond. Instead, her hands stretched out toward the void, my heart shattering as the whispers grew louder, mingling with her innocent laughter. "I'm sorry," I cried, feeling every ounce of regret spill from my mouth. "We can change it. We can change your name." But the moment felt futile, as if I were shouting into a void that would consume me whole. My daughter took a step forward, and as if the very essence of the thing she faced reached out, I saw her eyes turn dark, swallowed up by a vortex I couldn't see but felt deep in my bones. Just before all resonance was lost, I lunged, snatching her up and stumbling back, my heart racing as the air around us crackled with energy. In that split second, I understood, whatever was trying to pull her in wanted her. It wanted her because of her name. Without a second thought, I screamed, "Your name isn't Lila anymore. It's Rose." The air shifted with a chilling breeze, and the darkness in the room suddenly flickered, as if contemplating its grip. I grasped her tighter, expecting every spine-tingling whisper to break me down, but it withdrew, and Lila blinked up at me, eyes wide, as if she hadn't even registered the chaos around her. I took that moment to flee, racing to my wife, who stood paralyzed in the doorway, horror etched upon her face. "We need to change her name, we need to save her," I yelled, my voice frantic, but as I spoke, I saw the realization darken my wife's eyes. I was no longer the doting father, I had become the enemy. "You've gone too far," she screamed, thrusting one hand at me, the other clutching Lila tightly. "I will never forgive you for this." And then it all crashed down. My family and I were caught in an unending battle, one I never wanted. I was left with two choices: protect my daughter from an unseen force hell-bent on claiming her soul, or face a new terror, losing the only family I ever wanted because I dared to act on a fear that was dehumanizing my love. So here I am, battling between love and fear, asking everyone if I'm the asshole for refusing to change my daughter's name. But how do you explain there's something darker lurking just beyond the veil of understanding? Something that whispers when the wind blows, waiting for weakness to snatch away the light. Would you change something innocent to preserve what you love? Is it easier to accept loss than to fight through shadows? I wonder if I might lose them both, my Lila and the warmth of my wife, so I ask you, Ida? Growing up, my life revolved around my older brother, Ethan. He was everything I was not: confident, funny, and entirely carefree in a way I could only dream of being, but that same carelessness always felt like a dark cloud over my life, looming and heavy, especially on that one fateful day. I remember it clearly. The air was thick with anticipation as my family prepared for our annual reunion, a day meant for laughter, connection, and cherished memories, but also for my inevitable disappointment because of Ethan, a disappointment I'd felt boil over countless times before when his habitual tardiness consistently disrupted our family plans. This time it was supposed to be different. I'd even gone to my parents, pleading with them to keep Ethan in check, laying out the timeline filled with the events we all cherished, hoping they would help me make him see how his actions twisted the knife of frustration further each time he shrugged off our schedules. Yet, there I stood in front of the mirror that morning, my dress pressed, hair shining, and excitement bubbling in my gut, only to watch the clock turn and tick away, seconds slipping like grains of sand as our family slowly turned into a collection of impatient whispers, glances towards the door, and hollowed cheers that fizzled into disappointment. When my parents finally conceded and called Ethan, laughing over the phone, unaware of how those jokes tarnished my heart, the hour melted into a torturous waiting game, each tick a reminder of my brother's disregard for the rest of us. Hours passed and my anxiety morphed into rage, those tantalizing minutes becoming a suffocating noose that tightened around my throat. Finally, with the sun dipping below the horizon, marking the decline of our day, Ethan strolled through the door, carrying a pizza under his arm as if the world had been waiting for that slice of mediocrity alone. I lost it, the mounting frustration bubbling over like a volcano ready to erupt, and I screamed, the sound echoing off the walls, "Why do you always do this? You ruin everything for me." I felt all eyes shift to me, the room stagnant with shock, my parents' expressions morphing from shock into disappointment, but it was Ethan who looked at me with a flicker of hurt, his usually disarming grin fading into a frown. Maybe he had never realized how his actions shaped my reality, but at that moment, I didn't care. As I stormed out of the room, I heard my mother's soft spelling out, "You're being absurd, he's just late," and my chest tightened as I reacted with such venom. Were they really siding with someone who consistently disregarded their family's time and affection for a pizza and a laugh? I had wanted to express my hurt, to convey my pain about existence revolving around his whims, but laying bare those feelings only backfired as familial ties drew tighter around my throat, all grappling with how to cope with a raging younger sister while cradling the fragile ego of a fragile brother. It was in that mounting tension I sought solace in my room, the darkness blanketing me like an old friend, but the shame curled around me like a boa constrictor squeezing its prey, leaving me gasping. I thought of the times he'd made me late for getting ready for school, missing birthdays, the heartbreak of years trickling behind us due to an indifference only he seemed immune to. It was hard to swallow as I replayed the image of our relatives sitting around the dining table, smiles stretched thin as they forever remembered Ethan's absence rather than my achievements. Night fell and I heard them talking softly downstairs, the murmurs reaching my ears, and I couldn't help but feel something teetering on the edge of my mind, a dreadful thought that perhaps my voice, no matter how loud, would always be drowned in the wake of my brother's presence, one that echoed through the halls like a menacing shadow. I spent the night lost in drowned thoughts, and when the morning sun broke through my window, I peeked into the family room, clutching the banister tightly, but there I found my parents, their faces drawn and worried, sat with an empty space beside them where Ethan used to be, and a weird knot twisted in my stomach at the sight. It was strange. Usually, he'd be bouncing in, giving fake apologies like breadsticks tossed onto a dinner plate, but now, my heart was riddled with dread as I approached them tentatively, wondering how far I'd pushed him, wondering if those late nights and hollow experiences had locked him in a place where he didn't belong. As I sat, on a seat that suddenly felt too big, the silence wrapped around my family thicker than ever, my mother finally broke the tension, her eyes glistening with tears. Ethan left, and with those words hung heavy in the air, I realized how so much of our lives were measured in his tardiness, how selfish it all felt, and the confusion churned into a pang of guilt rendering me lost. I was supposed to confront him about the way he treated me, about the way his absence swallowed up my accomplishments, but here I sat weighted by emptiness instead. My brother's spirit lingered like fresh bread that had gone stale, something I could neither resent nor save. In the days that followed, the first miracle was the realization that distance unclogged the blindness I'd held, and as days turned to weeks flanked by his absence, I found myself grieving for a childhood adored but clouded with resentment. My parents would mention him in soft whispers around the dinner table, the empty space guarding each family event, our laughter suddenly fractured and memories of late arrivals now shadowed by the grief of what once was, shaping me into someone more disappointed in myself than in my brother. A haunting solitude crawled deep inside, filling me with a wish to turn back time, to reclaim that day and take back my screams, to find a way that wouldn't isolate us further but instead would help bind us. And just as I thought that sealing the crack would mean unearthing the monstrous entity of my own anger, a simple envelope slipped under the door with my name written on it in familiar handwriting. My chest pounded as I read the lines scrawled out, each word carrying a weight of grief and regret as he explained that he had finally realized how his actions affected those around him. It was an apology wrapped in his desire to become a better brother, one tempted by the promise of solace, a lifeline begging me to respond. I couldn't believe it. He'd owned up to his carelessness while I had been stuck in my own tourniquet of anger. Somehow, our screams had turned into words, into hopes that rallied back light, sparking a chance to rebuild. Weeks passed, and it felt like trudging through thick mud as I made my way back to face what I couldn't bear to confront. Did I dare call him? Did I risk the fragile connection we still shared? Should I finally save my family from the echoes of what we once knew? The light of realization glimmered, a bright opportunity thrumming at my core, and one day, with trembling hands, I called him, and as our conversation unfolded like a fateful return, I finally understood. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about finding a way to share both the darkness and the dawn that came with having a brother, no matter how late he arrived. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation that blurred the lines between right and wrong, but as I stood outside the theater, the vibrant energy of the evening dulled by a series of increasingly impatient glances, I wondered if I had crossed an invisible boundary. I was there to see Wicked, a show I'd been looking forward to for months, and as the line wrapped around the building under the bright streetlights, anticipation thickened in the air. My phone buzzed incessantly with eager messages from friends eager to meet after the show, but I was determined to shut it out and soak up the excitement. That's when I saw her, a woman, mid-30s, vibrant red hair cascading over her shoulders, standing right in front of me, engrossed in an animated phone conversation that seemed all too important to her. I tried to ignore the growing annoyance in my chest and drowned out her loud laughter, but every witty retort and self-indulgent chuckle felt like a dagger driving deeper into the heart of my evening. I mean, come on. Some of us were here to enjoy an extraordinary performance, not to witness private conversations at full volume. As the minutes ticked down to the start time, my irritation boiled over. "Excuse me." I mustered the courage to call out, the sound of my voice slicing through the buzz of excited chatter. She turned, her surprised eyes locking onto mine with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Can you please be a little quieter? Some of us actually want to enjoy the pre-show." The words rushed out like bile. A ripple of silence fell over the line, all eyes now glued to us. I could feel the weight of judgment in the air. What was supposed to be a brief moment of assertive clarity had turned into a live performance for the waiting crowd. Instead of shrinking back like I expected, she exploded. "Aren't you just the biggest little snob?" Her voice heightened, dripping with sarcasm. She held the phone in one hand, brandishing it like a sword, and her laughter abruptly transformed into a high-pitched giggle as if she were mocking me. Maybe if some of us weren't so uptight, we'd get to enjoy the show a bit more. Ever think of that? Each word hit hard, like stones thrown in anger, igniting a ripple of laughter behind her as her friends rallied around the charge. My fists clenched at my sides, the blood pounding in my ears so loudly I could barely hear my thoughts. I could see other theatergoers carving out their opinion in the way they looked at me, a mix of sympathy and disapproval. It was then that a realization struck, a crack in my composure. Maybe I was being unreasonable, but that didn't stop my temper from flaring, and before I knew it, I yelled back, "Maybe you don't need to share every detail of your miserable life with the world. Ever think some of us are here to escape it?" The gasp from the crowd was palpable, like a sudden intake of breath before an intense scene. The woman's face twisted in disbelief, her laughter abruptly cut off, leaving a painful silence hanging in the chilly night air. An angry flush crept up my neck, and just when I thought the moment might pass, she stepped closer, her eyes narrowed and her voice dropping to a whisper, bitter and low. "You think this is a show for you to escape to? You've only scratched the surface of what life can throw at you, and let me tell you, and I know you won't believe me, this is nothing compared to real pain." I felt something twist in my gut at the challenge in her gaze, a feeling that there was more at play than just a rude theatergoer. Each heartbeat echoed with my growing unease, and the crowd around us felt like they were holding their breath, waiting for a resolution to this absurdity that had taken on a life of its own. She was right, in a way. How could I know what monsters lurked in her reality? But as the theater doors swung open, spilling warm light and murmurs of music out into the cool night air, I realized I didn't care. I was tired, too tired, of dealing with selfish people in a world that oftentimes felt far too chaotic. Without thinking, I waved her off dismissively, my voice laced with frustration. "Whatever. Enjoy your unnecessary phone call." That must have struck a nerve, because she glanced back at me for a split second before rejoining her group of friends, and just as quickly as the confrontation had begun, it fizzled. I was left there, feeling the weight of my anger linger, tangled with something more profound, an unsettling sense of dread. The show started, and I tried to immerse myself in the enchantment of emerald green costumes and soaring melodies, but her laughter still rang in my ears, creating a friction in my mind I couldn't shake. What if she's right? My own thoughts haunted me like phantoms as I watched the story unfold on stage, the vibrant colors slipping by but never fully capturing my attention. Images of her piercing green eyes, that moment of shared rage, replayed in my mind. Who was I to judge anyone's choices, especially when my own life felt tangled and unpredictable? Then something shifted. I noticed she was sitting 2 rows down from me as the act wore on, and to my dismay, they were still laughing, still talking, this time at a whisper, but clearly still engaged with their phones, still distracting in ways that made me grit my teeth. The frustration boiled over again until I could stand it no longer. I stood up, heart pounding, and hissed, "Can you please just put your phones away and watch the show?" The words felt like fire leaping from my throat, but all they earned me was a triumphant glance from the woman. It was as if she was waiting for this, even expecting me to lash out again, and that was when I knew it was no longer about her phone call. It was an insidious dance of power and pride, and I was entrapped. She casually leaned back, smirk lacing her features. "You really think making this a bigger spectacle makes you some kind of hero?" She shot back, laughter bubbling from her lips, buoyed by the cheers of her friends. My blood turned to ice, and it dawned on me, I was being played. Her deliberate entrapment had turned the heat of my anger into a fiery embarrassment. Just as I recoiled, I felt a deep pull of anxiety fill the recesses of my mind, like an extreme panic gnawing at me, and I sank back into my seat, overwhelmed. I was now the unwitting star of a show I didn't intend to be in, and all I wanted was to disappear. After the final curtain call, I stumbled out onto the streets, a numbing shame seeping into my bones. I was both the villain and the fool, caught in a careless confrontation that had turned the joyous night sour. But as I walked away, I couldn't quite shake the sense that this experience had changed something within me. It was no longer just about her phone call, it was a mirror reflecting my own failings and a story that continued on without me, left to fester on the streets as I disappeared into the night. Was I the asshole for yelling? Maybe. But the truth stung brighter than any shame. Honesty splintered in a way I hadn't expected. My life was messy, and sometimes boundaries need to be drawn, even at the cost of losing sight of the enchantment a show could bring. So maybe, just maybe, the real question was, could I forgive myself for demanding silence in a world filled with chaos, or chalk it all up to an unhappy accident never to be resolved? I never thought a weekend getaway with my boyfriend and his family would leave me questioning my sanity, but here we are, with the shadows of the house enveloping me like a dark quilt of dread. It started innocently enough, with laughter filling the cozy air of his parents' cabin in the woods. We were greeted with warm hugs and the promise of memorable times, but as night fell, something felt off. The first evening, everything seemed fine. The arrangements were simple, two couples sleeping in respective bedrooms, and I felt comfortable nestled next to my boyfriend. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that his brother, Aaron, and his wife, Tara, were being overly favorable. They had just had a baby, which in turn shifted the dynamics. Everyone seems to tiptoe around them, as if their new little bundle of joy had installed an invisible hierarchy. The next morning, while I made coffee in the dim light of the kitchen, I overheard whispers in the living room, Aaron and Tara discussing how much easier they'd sleep in their own space and how much they appreciated the flexible accommodations this weekend. My mind raced. Flexible? I felt a lump form in my throat. We had less privacy because they brought their newborn, but nobody had bothered to consider how it would affect us. That night, I realized the sleeping arrangements had shifted again. Instead of sharing the queen bed in the guest room with my boyfriend, he was being shuttled to the living room sofa by his parents, while Aaron and Tara insisted on taking the guest room for the sake of the baby. The indignation rose in me like bile, and I couldn't hold back. When we gathered around the dinner table, I drew a deep breath and questioned why our plans had changed. I thought we were supposed to share the guest room, I probed, venom drenching my words despite my best efforts. His parents exchanged knowing glances, and I could feel tension crackling in the air like static. Ah, sweetheart, we made accommodations for Aaron and Tara. You understand, right? My boyfriend's mother, Brenda, responded in that sugary tone meant to placate, but I tasted the bitterness. No, I don't understand. We're all adults here. I don't see why their sleeping arrangement takes precedence. My voice was louder than I intended, and every pair of eyes locked onto me, filled with a mix of shock and disbelief. Tara is nursing. Aaron's voice broke through like ice, sharp and accusing. What do you expect us to do? Suddenly, the laughter of earlier seemed like a distant memory, and the room became thick with unspoken words and judgment. The dinner turned into an awkward game of silence, heavy and foreboding, and I felt utterly alone despite being surrounded by family. Yet, the more I stewed in my indignation, the more I longed for clarity, for some shred of acknowledgement that the unfairness was real. As darkness enveloped the cabin, I lay curled around the edges of myself, silence stalking me like a predator, and I could hear the soft cooings of the baby and the muffled laughter of the others in the living room. I slipped out into the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet, frustrated and lost. I could hear my boyfriend's breath beneath the sofa, as I tiptoed past the open guest bedroom, where the shadows cast by the nightlight danced ominously across the walls. The room felt cursed, a trap designed to keep me from reclaiming my sanity. It was then that I overheard a conversation drifting from the living room, cloaked in laughter and familiarity. She really needs to mind her place, Brenda said, and each of her words felt like a knife cutting into me. I just don't know why we're coddling her. It's not like she's family. My heart dropped like a stone in a well, the implications crashed over me, and suddenly, the realization that I was considered other in this family simmered under my skin. I mustered the courage and stepped back into their world, a world painted in shades of favoritism and bias. Why am I being pushed aside? I demanded, standing firm despite the quaking in my voice. The laughter halted, and all eyes swung toward me. I'm not asking for special treatment, I just want to be treated equally. They shifted uncomfortably as I forced them to confront the truth that hung in the air, thick as fog. I could see the irritation flare in Aaron's eyes, while Tara remained quietly smug, nursing their sweet little privilege. You're overreacting, Brenda scoffed, and I could feel heat coursing through my veins, a bubbling cauldron of adrenaline. No, I'm fighting for fairness, I shot back, feeling a strange empowerment surge within me. The tension unraveled as Aaron slammed his fist on the table, rising to meet me, his face flushed with anger. You think you deserve something special just because you're dating our brother? Get real. It felt like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I regretted voicing my frustrations, until I saw the conflict brewing behind my boyfriend's eyes. I could tell he was torn, caught between the impulse to defend me and the suffocating loyalty to his family that had been drummed into him since he was little. Finally, instead of collapsing under the weight of their cruel laughter, I turned my back on the room and marched out towards the exit. I needed air, fresh and untarnished, away from the clutches of their toxicity. As I reached the front porch, the moon hung low, bathing everything in a silvery hue that strangely felt like a blessing. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath of the fragrant pine, and my mind spun in circles, torn between loyalty and the burgeoning realization of who I am. Suddenly, the door behind me creaked open. I turned slowly to see my boyfriend standing there, a mix of shame and sorrow in his eyes. I'm sorry, he murmured, his voice shaky. I should have said something. But as he said it, I realized that words often mean nothing without action. And in that moment, wrapped in the solitude of darkness, I understood something terrifying. I was the outsider here. You can't apologize if you don't mean it, I said, my heart breaking with every syllable. His face fell, and the heaviness of my own truth rooted me to the spot. I wanted to run but instead felt the weight of the world on my shoulders as realization sank in. What was I, if not a mere guest in a house that should have felt like home? But as the night unfolded, the silence became a canvas where I painted the chilling realization, sometimes the truth is that you don't belong, even when love is tangled in the mess. And as my feet pushed me away from the cabin, echoes of their laughter haunting my ears like shadows, I knew I had crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed, and the darkness of the woods became my only solace as they faded into the background, leaving me to navigate the twisted path of life alone. When I married Derek, I knew right from the start that I'd have to navigate the murky waters of his past. After all, his ex-wife, Lisa, hadn't just exited his life like some forgettable chapter. She was a ghost that lingered in every conversation, in the decorations of our shared home that sometimes felt like borrowed nostalgia, and most importantly, in the shadow of her new wife, Anna, who, as odds would have it, turned out to be someone who had an unsettling tendency to insert herself into our lives. It all came to a head one gloomy afternoon in early November, when Derek and I had just settled into our weekend routine of lazy brunch and Netflix. My phone buzzed with a message from Lisa, and I braced myself for the usual pleasantries, some innocent inquiry about the kids, maybe, but as I opened the text, I found Anna's name splattered across the screen. I heard you don't want to meet me. That's okay, I understand your feelings. It rattled me, and I tried to shove the inexplicable anxiety down, telling myself it was merely a misguided attempt at something resembling friendship. The truth was, the more I read about Anna, the new wife in a life that should have been severed from Derek but wasn't, the more I could feel the small hairs on the back of my neck prickle, sharper than any ghost's whisper, and it wasn't long before my polite refusals morphed into something darker. I told Derek I didn't want to meet her. He frowned as if he was about to argue, and years of marital negotiations played out in my mind, but thankfully, he kept his mouth shut, a shift I accepted, thinking perhaps he was on my side after all, until one fateful Friday night when the walls felt too thin and the shadows seemed to breathe. I woke in the middle of the night to a banging sound, loud and urgent, enough to rattle the very foundations of our home, but panic surged through me when I realized the noise was coming from the back door, where our kitchen met the dim alley behind our condo. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the sound, heart hammering in my chest, but just as I reached for the door, a figure darted into the darkness, a fleeting glimpse that caught my breath, Anna, standing there for just a second before vanishing into the abyss, and I swore I could taste her defiance in the air, a bitter tang tinged with a sense of ownership that made me feel as if she was daring me to come out and play. All the warning bells were clanging in my mind. One moment, I felt frozen, and in the next, I was racing back to my bedroom, where Derek slept soundly, blessedly unaware of the chaos of women that seemed determined to ruin our lives. Days passed in a surreal blur, where Anna's shadow loomed larger, and I came to know my own home as a battlefield. I began to hear whispers when no one was around, felt prying eyes watching through curtains when the sun went down, and every so often, I'd catch sight of a figure disappearing into the corner of my vision in the dimly lit spaces of our life. It got to the point of paranoia. I convinced myself Anna was playing some cruel game, trying to push me into a confrontation that, for her, would be thrilling, as if my refusal to engage with her was some sort of challenge she was determined to win. I lashed out at Derek more than ever, accusing him of being too close to his past, a ghost silently haunting our house even during daylight hours. But as it often goes in life, I soon learned that my sleepless nights came at a cost. One rainy afternoon, I received a surprise visit from Derek's sister, Rachel, well-intentioned, but her chatter about family gatherings, during which Anna had been graciously invited, felt sharp, like a knife twisting in my gut. It was on the tip of my tongue to unleash the devils I'd been keeping close, but I bit down murkily, burying my grievances underneath polite smiles, and yet my mind wandered back to Anna, worrying and careful like a spider spinning a web that seemed to ensnare us all in its delicate but unforgiving threads. When I finally reached my breaking point, it was during a dinner party, where the corny ambience of laughter and clinking glasses masked the war raging in my heart. Derek's family, including Lisa, stood in our backyard under twinkling fairy lights, and as if summoned by dark magic, Anna appeared, lovely in an ethereal way that cut into my self-worth like a knife. She greeted everyone breezily, and the taunting gleam in her eyes while she exchanged pleasantries with Derek felt like high stakes. Couldn't they see that she was here to replace me? That I would ultimately become just another piece in a twisted puzzle built on miscommunication and misunderstanding? As I stepped outside, my heart raced cold in my chest. I realized something had to give. In the very first moment I tried to confront her, adrenaline coursing through my veins, things spiraled faster than I could comprehend. "I don't want to talk to you," I asserted a bit too loudly, well aware that the party had all but faded into the background of our confrontation, glances darting between us as if we were the main event. But Anna just laughed lightly, brushing her hair back and holding my gaze with a fierce confidence that knocked wind out of me. "Why do you refuse? You don't have to be so afraid, you know. There's enough room in this life for all of us." Those words hung in the air like a curse, and an inexplicable dread gripped me, transforming my knees into gelatin. My refusal solidified into some sickening reality, that I was terrified, yes, terrified of this woman, this specter of Derek's past and the embodiment of a person who wouldn't just let go. She wanted to stake her claim, and here I was on trial for an invisible crime, sentenced simply for existing next to a ghost. Their laughter felt like a mocking eulogy to a life I had desperately tried to forge, and the air turned thick with tension, so palpable that I could likely cut it with a butcher's knife. It overwhelmed me until the needs for confrontation morphed into something twisted, darker. I wasn't just refusing to meet her, I was staring into a chasm, both terrified and intoxicated by the possibility of falling right in, resisting the call of something sinister I couldn't articulate. And then, just like that, it happened. The lights flickered overhead, plunging us into a surreal dance of shadows before a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated Anna's face, and in that single flicker, her grin twisted into something malicious, the kind that made my heart pound. The conversation fell silent, as if the world could feel the tremor of impending doom, and in that moment, I knew something in me snapped. I couldn't just refuse to acknowledge her anymore. The fear that had been simmering transformed into sheer defiance, something wild and unrestrained. With a smirk, I stepped forward into the abyss, ready to confront the specter that had taken over my life, but the response from Anna was chilling. She took a step back, eyes wide and retreating. It was then I realized I'd become more than just a new player in a game of old lovers. I'd become something darker, something powerful that didn't intend to share. In that strange moment of clarity, with my newfound conviction, I finally understood the horror that wasn't found within Anna's taunts or sneers, but within my own reflection warped within a fragmented mirror of shared pasts and futures. I was battling not just for myself, but for Derek, and the life we had built, and as Anna retreated under the gaze of our onlookers, I couldn't help but wonder, was I really prepared for what I had awakened? What dark consequences awaited us all? The space shimmered with unspoken words and unresolved fears, each person witnessing the birth of a new tension, and amidst it all, that question echoed endlessly in my mind: AITA for refusing to talk to my husband's ex-wife's wife? But truthfully, maybe it was time to discover what lay beneath the surface, to revisit every last secret buried in the darkness that would ultimately either free us or consume us. I always thought the worst pain I could feel was when I found out my parents were getting divorced, but that feeling shifted like quicksand the night my little sister, Lily, came to me with tear-stained cheeks, her voice trembling as she confessed that she had gotten her first period. She was just 11, and the innocence of her childhood streaked through her eyes, now clouded with embarrassment and confusion. I had been bracing myself for a long time, what with the endless conversations overheard at school and the so-called talk my mother gave me 2 years prior, but nothing could prepare me for the look on Lily's face, that mixture of fear and a burgeoning understanding of the chaos that awaited her. I tried to put on a brave face, forcing myself to recall the advice I had read online, about being supportive, about nurturing that bond since we relied on each other like life buoys in an unforgiving sea, even more so now that our parents were consumed by their own turmoil and neglecting us, both lost in their separations. I pulled her into my arms, and as she sobbed quietly against me, I was instantly pulled into a pit where the emotions swirled like a dark tornado, and in that moment I knew I had to step up, to protect her from the harshness of reality. I grabbed a roll of toilet paper and a pad from the bathroom, mind racing, recalling our mom's half-hearted attempts to prepare Lily for this moment. I quickly returned to her, guiding her through the basics, but in doing so, I stumbled upon an unsettling reality hidden in the folds of my sister's innocence. She revealed, hesitantly, that the other girls in school mocked her for being late and starting her period, whispered cruel jokes about how unsophisticated she was while hinting at something I feared she'd overheard about girls turning into women. I assured her it was normal, that our bodies had a way of doing things at their own pace, but as I said it, guilt gnawed at my insides, eating away at my conscience. How could I comfort her when I knew that what lay ahead would likely be filled with heartache, loneliness, and fear? We sat there on the edge of her bed, the quiet of night wrapping around us like a cold blanket, and with every wave of her breath against my shoulder, I felt the enormity of her vulnerability resting heavily on me. I tasked myself with being her protector in a world that often felt far too dark and unforgiving. I promised her that she wouldn't have to go through this alone, that I would always be there. Little did I know, those words would lead us down a path none of us were prepared for. The next day, Lily seemed different, almost more mature, as if a weight had somehow settled into her. I didn't take long before I began to feel something changing within myself, too, like some awful mirroring effect was taking place. In my quest to become her shield, I found myself swallowed by her emotional storm, helplessly caught in the eye where everything around us felt disorienting. I began to notice things. She developed new friends, appeared distant, but the worst part was the way I sensed something festering beneath her surface, like an unfathomable darkness or perhaps that deep sorrow that lingered behind her eyes. I wanted to speak to her, to coax out the shadows that now seemed to dance around her, but every time I did, she would brush me off with an insistent wave of her hand. One night, fueled by concern, I crept into her room after our parents had gone to bed. She was still awake, buried under the glow of her cell phone, and I plopped down next to her. I didn't even need to ask when she shifted, revealing a chat filled with messages that were thrusting her further into a world I didn't understand, middle school dramas, hints of early romances, and then, hammering home the point, someone had sent her a picture that left me cold. It was explicit, shocking, and everything a part of me wanted to shield her from. I felt furious. No, it was rage boiling underneath. How could anyone do that to someone so young? Without thinking twice, I confronted her gently, asking who was sending these things, our conversation turning sharp and painful as I realized she hadn't grasped the true weight of what she was dealing with. In that moment, too many emotions washed over me, but most of all was a feeling of isolation. I couldn't figure out how to help her, how to explain the monsters that lurked in the shadows without utterly breaking her spirit. Days turned into weeks, marked by evenings spent tiptoeing around her feelings while leaving me in the dark as she continued to withdraw. The minute she slipped out of my sight, it felt like I watched her die a little more every day, unraveling from love and into something that, well, what? I started to piece things together, realizing she began skipping classes, never mentioning who she was with, and then one day, she didn't come home at all. My heart crashed and burned in swirls of chaos as I called her friends, her school, my hands trembling in utter panic. Each second she remained away felt like ice carving into my veins until finally, as dusk set in, she sauntered through the door, seemingly unfazed by the hours spent being lost. As I bolted to her side, I searched her downcast eyes for answers, feeling that primal instinct to protect her surge one last time. When I asked where she was, she bristled, snapped back like a taut string before slipping into silence. I grabbed her arm, desperation creeping under my skin, and that was when things took a twisted turn. I felt fire ignite within her gaze, a fierce rebellion that she was beginning to nurture, and in the split second I had touched her, something deep inside flickered. I didn't expect her to lash out, her entire being springing into life, demanding that I back off. In that moment, I knew I had gone too far, that I had unintentionally shoved her closer to the edge. I hadn't voiced the words that were screaming in my mind. I was afraid that forcing her to reveal herself would only make her run further into that abyss. A part of me didn't want her to feel like I was another adult trying to control her. I had hoped to be her ally, her refuge, but she stomped upstairs, slamming the door in my face, and my heart shattered. For the next few days, I treaded carefully around the house, tiptoeing as if walking on shards of glass, instinctively holding my breath each time I heard her room creak. Then, another vision of anger flashed unveiled. I could feel my heart thundering as I heard muffled laughter from her direction, friends gathering outside to tease, and I saw them, those girls I had never approved of before. Who were they? I wanted to know why they were allowed to drag her into their world when it seemed to drip with deceit. I was about to barge out there, to pull her back, but suddenly I stopped. I felt this cold wave of clarity, recognizing that if I did invade her space, my little sister may very well tumble into an abyss far darker than what I had imagined. Instead, I chose silence, wrestling with the demons of self-doubt feeling heavy on my shoulders. Days blurred into months like an out-of-focus movie reel, and soon, my worst fears became reality. I found myself sitting across from a counselor, poring over the underlying pains that now accompanied our family, the way it twisted into this labyrinth of hurt, questioning where I had failed in being a sibling, and somewhere along the lines, I realized I had handed her over to those shadows, letting those dark forces seep through like poison into her very core. The last few weeks since we had that fight left me shattered. Late-night phone calls from parents screaming over the phone made everything tragic, like a play for a performance nobody wanted to witness. I felt the sting each time I saw her retreat into the darkness, feeling helpless behind my own walls, and knowing I would likely remain in the background while she began to spiral down that path without me. What hurt most was the knowledge that, while I had desperately tried to be her savior, I had ultimately failed in one crucial aspect. I didn't truly understand that stepping up meant giving her the space to figure out her identity without my controlling shadow looming over. The question haunted me, echoing incessantly, was I truly right or utterly selfish in wanting to drag her back from that darkness? What I had to learn, and what I hoped she could too, was that the road toward each other may be laden with shadows, but if she were in the darkness, I would be waiting for her beacon light, hoping she wasn't too far from remembering how to shine. I never thought refusing to babysit my niece would lead to such a haunting series of events, but here I am, fingers trembling over my keyboard, desperate to share what transpired. It all began with a simple family gathering, my heart warm from the laughter and the clinking of glasses, until my sister, Lily, confronted me. She didn't care for the way I brought my boyfriend, Jake, around. She said it was inappropriate, like a circus show crashing into a serene family picnic. I was blindsided, and feeling cornered, I snapped, telling her that I wouldn't stand for her judgmental attitude and her constant need to control who I bring into our family's space. She retaliated by demanding I babysit her kids that weekend, as if promising to take care of her children hinged on my compliance. I returned home in a rage, refusing to justify myself further. A cloud of tension hung over my mind, but I convinced myself it was just typical family drama and that things would blow over. However, that very night, I received a call from my brother-in-law, frantic and nearly incoherent. He said something had happened, that the kids weren't behaving, and Lily was off the deep end. Wordlessly, I felt the shadow of dread creep in. It turned out he was wrong. Lily had taken the kids to a local fair, and when she didn't come back, well, the phone calls began flooding in. Hours stretched into what felt like an eternity, my stomach knotting more tightly with each unanswered ring, until they found her car abandoned in the parking lot, the engine still warm, and the haunting echoes of laughter from the carnival turned into sirens and chaos. It was only after frantic searches that they found her 3 blocks away, screaming at the top of her lungs, but not for help. She was screaming at her kids, who stood there, petrified with wide eyes and trembling limbs. The problem? She claimed she had seen something dark and lurking, something that she insisted was trying to get them. It wasn't just a skit, it was real to her. The way she talked about it, like it was a relentless predator stalking the shadows, had everyone on edge. It landed her in a psychiatrist's office, the official diagnosis being acute stress reaction. She could no longer care for her kids without assistance, and that's when the guilt hit me like a freight train. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I should have just sucked it up and done my part while juggling my own feelings about Jake. Instead, I'd stood my ground like some stubborn rock while she spiraled into the unknown. It didn't help that the kids became more withdrawn. They wouldn't speak about the fair or even look me in the eye anymore. So, feeling responsible, I offered to step in on weekend babysitting duties to support her recovery, but the atmosphere felt heavy, thick with unfinished chords that resonated unanswered questions. I began to notice strange things happening during these sessions. The kids would stare at empty corners of the room, whispering things I couldn't hear. Their faces turned pale as if they saw memories of something wicked, and one evening, while I was trying to distract them with movies, I caught them doodling in their coloring books. One innocent scrawl read, "It saw us." I brushed it aside, chalking it up to vivid imaginations, but then I heard soft thumps coming from upstairs when nothing was up there. My heart raced. I pushed through the fear, convincing myself it was old house creaks. But when the children's laughter turned to sobs, and they refused to go near the window, I decided I needed to confront this terrifying new reality. There was a lingering chill each night, and as I'd watch the kids fall asleep, I'd scour every inch of the house trying to find traces of what had stolen their joy. Then one night, while flipping through channels with the twins snuggled under blankets, a local news report caught my attention, a witness account claiming in the area, and I swear to you, it was the exact description of what my sister had said she saw. Something with long fingers and a grotesque face that would make shadows tremble. Feeling sickened, I dismissed it as coincidence but couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me. I called Lily, her voice muffled and terrified, begging me not to let the kids go outside alone, and suddenly, everything spiraled out of my control. I thought I was doing good by stepping in, but it only worsened. The kids' nightmares turned real, and they refused to stay in their rooms, screaming about the thing in the shadows whenever night fell. I tried to reassure them, but all they could talk about was how it knew where they were and how it wanted to take them. Every night, I'd hear the soft whispering and see shadows darting past the corners of my vision. I was sleepless, frantic, and terrified. Months went by and therapy didn't help Lily, and when I finally stole a moment to lay out everything that happened to my boyfriend, Jake, he listened, shaken but resolute, telling me we'd investigate the house. The moment we walked into that living room, I caught Jake watching the children out of the corner of his eye, murmuring, "It's just an illusion." I had hoped he was right. I couldn't bear the thought of the monstrous beliefs consuming my family. So one evening, armed with only a flashlight, we ventured through the attic, but all we found were old boxes and dusty memories until an unearthly silence hung in the air. I flipped the switch, and together, we felt the temperature drop, hardly a breath could be heard, and suddenly those whispers kicked in more clearly. In sharp clarity, I felt it wash over me, an overwhelming sense of dread cementing my feet to the floor, and Jake jerked back, his face paling as he swept the beam across the shadows. And there it was, lurking in the edges, a twisted shape standing tall, fingers stretching impossibly long towards us. I wanted to scream. My instincts yelled to run, to grab the kids and flee, but in that moment, terror froze us in time. The thing whispered a name, my sister's name, and I realized then that it had wanted her all along, wanting to drag her into its world of darkness. That's when I heard my niece's voice, soft, innocent, and oh so familiar, calling me from downstairs, begging me to come play. I snapped awake from my horror, clutching my boyfriend's arm, and somehow rushed down the stairs, screaming for the kids to get away from the windows, but the room was empty. Silence smothered me alive, and when we managed to tear ourselves outside, a suffocating realization washed over me: the children were gone. Lily, lost in her own hell, and my family fracturing from the inside out, while the shadows grew ever longer. So now I sit here, sleepless, haunted, wrapped in both guilt and unanswered questions, because the thing that took my niece, that thing that chased echoes across our lives, had started as a mere judgment at a party, spiraling into a nightmare I never wanted to be a part of. AITA for refusing to babysit when I had no clue it would unravel into a much darker unfolding? I never thought a simple trip to the store would turn my life upside down, but here I am, staring at a deliberately cracked rearview mirror and my shaking hands as I replay that day like a broken record. It was a Thursday afternoon when I made my way to the local grocery store, the kind where you can already smell the fresh bread wafting through the air the moment you step inside. I parked my car, a rickety old hatchback that sometimes felt more like a death trap than a mode of transport, and grabbed my reusable bags, satisfied at the thought of stocking up on supplies for the week ahead. As soon as I stepped out into the sun, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, but I shrugged it off. I was just being paranoid. As I navigated through the aisles, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, I felt an odd sense of unease gathering in the pit of my stomach, like a storm gathering clouds, but the distraction of choosing ripe avocados kept me focused. Then, just as I was about to pay, the store manager, a burly man with a thick mustache, confronted me. He pointed an accusatory finger and demanded to know why I had parked in the customer parking lot despite being a non-customer. My heart sank as I stammered out an explanation, grappling for words to deny the absurd claim. The truth was, I had shopped there plenty before. I was a loyal customer even if I wore the same ratty hoodie every time. But he wasn't having it, and soon enough, a crowd gathered around us like vultures drawn to a dying animal, some taking pictures on their phones, others whispering behind their hands. I felt my face burn as outrage and embarrassment battled inside me. I tried to plead my case, but the manager's eyes were void of sympathy, and he kept saying I had stolen a space meant for paying customers, almost reveling in my unease. The chatter swirled around me, and through it all, I became acutely aware of the other customers' judgmental stares, their silent alliances forming against me. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around to see a stranger who claimed to have witnessed everything. The wrinkle-faced woman looked deep into my eyes and said she had seen me walk into the store without a cart, evidence of my guilt, she implied. Before I knew it, I was in a full-blown confrontation, surrounded by angry voices as the scene devolved, and I felt trapped in a surreal nightmare where all I wanted was to grab my groceries and leave. I thought I would cry, the humiliation of it all, so I decided to cut my losses and walk away. But before I made it to the door, I heard a loud shout that made me spin. "You think this is okay? You think you can do whatever you want?" It was a younger guy. He must have been no older than 25, and he was practically shaking with rage. My instinct told me to just leave, yet I felt a compulsion to respond. "I can park anywhere that's not specifically marked," I said, my voice tinged with desperation. "I'm a customer." Somehow, the words fell flat, and within minutes, I felt like I was the villain in a crime thriller. People were snapping photos, and I couldn't help but feel like I was reshaping their perception of me into something monstrous and self-serving. Heavy with the risk of escalation, I bolted toward my car, but the crowd followed me, whispers morphing into accusations, and I could hear the word entitlement thrown around like a weapon. My shaking fingers struggled with the keys, the metal digging into my palm like the weight of the judgments surrounding me. In that moment, a primal panic kicked in, and I took off, barely managing to slam the door behind me before revving the engine. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The crowd dwindled, but still, those eyes followed me as I sped away, fueled by something more than just righteous indignation. I thought about what they believed of me, a thief in plain view, a villain unseen until I was thrust into the light. I had an incessant feeling of being stalked as I drove home, every car a possible threat, every intersection a heightened crossroads of shame. By the time I reached my neighborhood, the weight of my crime settled heavily on my shoulders, pulling my spirit down. I locked the door behind me, determined never to revisit that store again, but the fallout was far from over. Over the next few days, I watched anxiously as the topic spiraled on social media. Someone had posted a video of the confrontation, painting me as a monster in need of public scorn. The comments were merciless, people calling for my head because of a miscommunication blown out of proportion. I struggled to sleep. Images of that mob haunted me as I tossed and turned, each creak of the house sending jolting terror coursing through me. I tried to remain disconnected, but it was impossible to ignore the shame, the anger, and the community I thought I belonged to suddenly turning their backs on me. I stopped going out, avoiding the grocery store like it was a plague zone, but I still heard whispers as I passed others in my neighborhood. Then came the calls. I got them all right, late at night just as I was starting to succumb to the silence of my home. They were taunting, anonymous voices echoing the very accusations that had attacked me days prior. I blocked number after number, but they kept coming, like a relentless tide, washing over me, burying me in guilt for something I had believed was just a simple parking dispute. I no longer found joy in cooking for myself or curling up with a good book. All I felt in the pit of my stomach was an ever-gnawing shame that clung to me like a shadow, relentless and suffocating. I began to question my own sanity. Had I really parked illegally? Did my neighbor slip the manager my license plate? The whispers grew louder, and they felt like the predator closing in on its prey. Then one night it all came to a head. I found myself pacing the floor, drowning out the voices in my head. I had to know the truth. The next day, I ventured out once more, heart pounding like a drum but determined to confront my fears head-on. I needed to know if it was true or just a horrible delusion created by my escalating paranoia. I parked in a remote corner of the lot, hidden behind a line of bushes, and I watched as the store, the employees, the manager, the customers, all of them went about their business, seemingly unaware of the nightmare that they had thrust upon me. It was then that I saw her, the woman from that day, her eyes scanning the parking lot, locking once again on a car that was far from mine. I noticed something was off, a slight look of satisfaction overtaking her usually neutral expression as she walked toward the store. She turned and looked right in my direction, but I was smart enough to stay hidden. In that haunting moment, I understood, this was never about a parking lot. It was about a power struggle, a humiliation that they sought to inflict on someone who didn't fit their ideal of a perfect customer. I got back into my car and drove away, heart racing, but deep down I felt empowered. I finally had clarity of a sort. Perhaps I could never return to a place I loved, but now I knew, I was never going to be their scapegoat again. In lieu of acceptance, I chose to carve out my own reality, for whatever it was worth. As for the accusations, Ida. Well, maybe parking in that lot was the least of my sins, but now I'm focusing on how to rise from the ashes of a grocery store confrontation that left me feeling more human than ever.